Hey guys, I'm Vorpal, and today we're going to talk about how the Path of Exile economy works and what lessons we can take away from it. And if you stay tuned to part two, what I'll get into is why the Path of Exile economy is better designed and feels so much better than what we have in the United States. So let's jump in. The first thing to cover is how PoE works. So you have a character, you get to run around in the world that we live in. You'll see monsters, and you will over time kill all of these monsters. And as you do so, they will drop loot in the form of currency and items. So the goal of the game, in addition to having fun, is to progress. And so you'll start the game off as a relatively weak character, and most monsters will be substantially stronger than you, and you have to use skill to defeat them. But the progression path for most people is to get to a point where you can trivialize the content. And so you just run around and everything melts in your path. And you do this primarily by upgrading the gear of your character. And so as you get better and better gear, you're able to not be killed, as well as to one-shot monsters in your path. The way that you upgrade your gear in Path of Exile is you generate wealth. And you can either buy gear from other players, or you can make your own. Now, there are three ways to generate wealth in Path of Exile. The first is you can farm the wealth yourself. So you'll run around, kill as many monsters as possible, drop more and more loot, use that loot presumably to either equip or buy gear. The second thing you can do to generate wealth is to craft gear, either for your own character to use, or you can sell this gear to other players for a profit. And the third thing you can do that I'm not going to spend too much time on today is you can play the market. So if you understand how the market typically evolves over time in Path of Exile, or you know what items are underpriced, you can snag them up, flip them, and make a profit. And we consider that hideout warriors, and if you compare to modern days, that would be like your stockbrokers, investment banks. So the whole point, though, is that you want to generate more wealth to be able to buy better and better gear. Now, you can do that in a few ways. The first is you can juice your maps. So here, we have a T17 map. You can use currency to make these maps better and better for you in terms of two different dimensions. One is making sure you get the right penalties on the map to make sure your build can handle it. And then the second is the multipliers that you see up top. And those, you're looking for specific multipliers depending on your farming strategy. So in our case, we're looking for scare multipliers. These maps generate substantially more loot than your average map. So this is a way of kind of progressing your character and generating more wealth. Another way is to craft gear. And so you can do this with a crafting bench using currency. Path of Exile has arguably the most sophisticated crafting system in all of video games. So there's a lot of different ways to make gear to target specific traits and deterministically get them. And again, you can either equip this gear for your own character, or you can sell it off, usually at a profit. Now, over time, every strategy generates kind of a different amount of wealth. In each league, it varies a bit. And so that's part of what's interesting, is finding your strategy each league. But generally speaking, you'll have low budget strategies. And the most common low budget strategy is your alch and go. So that means you're just slamming an alchemy orb onto a map, running the map, dropping whatever you can. This strategy has very low cost, practically zero, once you get it up and running. And then it generates, a modest amount of revenue each map. There are a ton of strategies, but as you get further and further along this curve, what will essentially happen is you will progress like this. But what's important to understand in Path of Exile is it costs substantially more to run these strategies. Nothing is free. So an alch and go strategy is never going to generate as much loot or as much wealth as a higher investment strategy. And so this gives players that feeling of progression, but it also allows you to get richer as time goes on. Now, what's interesting in Path of Exile about this curve is that if you think about your strategies in terms of margin, and that is to say margin being the amount of money you generate divided by your cost. What essentially happens is as you invest more and more into your strategies, your profit margin will actually go down. But the reason why no one cares about this is because your profit per hour goes up. And so yes, you're investing more, you're making more, your profit ratio goes down. However, because you're doing all this in a shorter and shorter period of time, the amount of money you're generating on an hourly basis goes up. And this progression is what allows people to exponentially scale the power of their build so that they can trivialize as much content as they want, often with the skills that they want to have fun with. So this dynamic is pretty unique, but very important to making Path of Exile feel rewarding, but also feel like you're choosing to do harder and harder content, and you're rewarded for that choice. Now, what also makes Path of Exile particularly interesting compared to a lot of other games out there is the interaction and the economy between players. So let's say you have your poor player, your low budget player that can't afford to do much. They're going to be focusing on dropping materials for other players that they themselves don't run. So we have Scarabs and we have T17 maps. And there's a lot of lower budget strategies that are relatively good at dropping these types of materials. What they'll do is they will trade those to the wealthiest players in Path of Exile who are really efficient at using them. And those players will drop even more loot and usually different categories of loot. So, we have the Mirror of Kalandra as well as Mage Blood. Your average player is never going to drop those in a league, but they might be able to work their way up to buying them from someone who does drop them by selling all of these kind of lower end materials. And this interaction really helps keep Path of Exile balanced, because as farming strategies get more and more lucrative, people will stop farming all of the materials that are used to fund those strategies, and then the price of those will go up and people will kind of oscillate back and forth. And so this is something that a lot of players take advantage of, and it helps keep the economy relatively balanced. Now, despite all this, despite this balance, what essentially happens throughout the course of a league is as players farm more and more loot, they add more and more currency into the economy. So these are chaos orbs. This is one of the standard currencies that people use to trade. And if an infinite amount of chaos orbs get added to the economy, well, that would cause a never-ending cycle of inflation. Instead, what happens is as players use those currency to roll their maps, to craft better gear, that currency effectively leaves the economy and reduces the total amount of currency in the market, and that kind of creates a second layer of control on inflation. So the first layer being the players trade with each other for different strategies. Second layer is that currency is actually leaving the market, which is really, really important in Path of Exile. Now, all of this gets best represented in the form of inflation graphs. So we have our divine orb in terms of cost of chaos, as well as our mirror shard, which is used to make a mirror. Both of these, you'll notice, go up over the course of a league. Now, what's interesting about inflation is that some currencies will basically go up and up and up and up forever, whereas your divine orb does tend to settle to a specific amount. The reason for that is because divine orbs are a sort of middle layer currency. They're used to craft better gear, but their potential is somewhat limited, whereas a mirror allows you to copy the literal best items in the game. So there's really not much better than a mirror at the end of the day. And because of this, divine orbs tend to cap out as the relative utility between chaos orbs and divine orbs kind of hits a nice balance, but mirrors will just continue going up over the course of a league. Now, what's important is that these ratios remain somewhat reasonable for players. And so the steeper they go up, the higher the rate of inflation is within Path of Exile. And that has a whole bunch of consequences. So imagine we have our wealth distribution graph here. So let's say that total amount of wealth is in the whole league is represented up here. And on the bottom, we have from left to right our poorest player in Path of Exile all the way to our richest player in Path of Exile. Now, let's pretend for a moment we had perfect equality. And that's to say that the poorest player has the exact same amount of wealth as the richest player. We would draw a line like this, and it's linear, which is really important. So this becomes our reference line. This represents equality. Now, what it'll end up looking like is there is not perfect equality in Path of Exile, nor any other market for that matter. So instead, what we'll do is we'll graph, and it'll look something like this. And this exponential curve basically represents the fact that as you move from poorest player to richest player, each player has an increasing share of the total wealth in the economy. And what you can do is you can kind of abstractly measure the amount of inequality in the economy by taking the area between these two curves. So the more this curve moves away from equality, the more inequality there exists in the market. Now, what's really important is how that relates to inflation, because they are related. So again, let's look at our rate of change. And what we'll do is we're going to graph kind of an abstract representation of inflation. So let's say this blue line represents inflation. What will happen is every player's wealth and every kind of class of players' wealth is changing relative to inflation. So if this is inflation, you can imagine your top 1% of players, their wealth is going to look like this. And so at the very beginning of the league, they start off just like everyone else. But as they figure out strategies and they're good at the game and they're good at understanding the market, they will start far outpacing inflation. And this allows the top 1% of players to buy or make the very best gear you can possibly imagine. Now, what makes Path of Exile really compelling is that your average player ends up being like this. They're still above inflation. And what this means is that they are, as they play the game, they're accumulating wealth. They're able to buy better and better gear and get stronger. They may not be able to buy the very best gear in the entire game, but they are able to progress that character and feel like it's worthwhile to continue playing the game. What happens, though, is that you can have some players that end up below inflation. And this is your really, really sad player who's probably going to quit the game. Because as they play, everything's getting more and more expensive, and you start to lose interest, essentially. The game becomes no longer fun. If you're grinding gear games or GGG, you want as few people underneath this line as possible. Because it's demotivating, these players will quit. They're not going to buy skins. They're not helping GG out by playing the game. They're quitting. Now, I mentioned it's really important to understand both of these curves. And that is because the more wealth inequality that exists in a league, the more this 50th percentile will get close to or even go below inflation. And so what that will feel like is really bad to the average player in Path of Exile. And we have had a few instances of that in the past, but it's almost always been the result of either a bug or an exploit or an unintended interaction. And so an example of an unintended interaction happened a few leagues ago with the Fortunate card and burial chambers, and players figuring out how to just drop obscene amount of divines in a relatively short period of time. No one was really cheating. It just wasn't an intended interaction from the game developers. And so they very quickly stepped in. They got rid of the scarabs that were allowing players to do that. And that fixed wealth inequality over the next few days, and things kind of rebounded. So GGG pays a lot of attention to this curve, to wealth inequality, because it does have a substantial impact on the average player and their enjoyment and progression of the game. To kind of illustrate this in a very specific example, let's take that T17 map earlier, and we were using chaos orbs to roll it to make them better. Imagine for a second that next league, Grinding Gear Games decided to say, you know what, you can actually just roll your T17 maps for free. It's not going to cost anything. This would have a substantial impact on the economy. So if you remember our equality line being here, what this would do, because these T17 maps no longer cost currency to run, well, that's going to do a couple things. One, it's going to increase inflation because now there's one less opportunity for chaos orbs to leave the economy. And two, it's going to decrease wealth inequality, increase wealth inequality because let's say your average player up to about this point in the curve can't actually run T17 maps. And so everybody who can run T17 maps is going to make a lot more profit per hour than they were before, but everybody who can't run them is going to suddenly start making less relative to the total wealth in the economy. And so what would end up happening is our inflation curve, our top 1%, we're still going to be really high, but what our middle 50th percentile would do is that they would probably come down or below inflation. And this would be really bad. So these currency sinks being in the game are really important to remove wealth from the economy, but also slow down wealth generation from your top earners, your wealthiest players. Now, another way of framing that is the richer you are in Path of Exile, the richer your strategy, the more you're paying to run that strategy. Not just in total amount of currency, but as a percentage of your income in Path of Exile. That dynamic is super important. So to recap, every league, Path of Exile has a fresh economy. And this gives the game developer an opportunity to make a lot of changes, reset drop rates, introduce new strategies. But most importantly, every league, the inflation that will naturally occur as people play the game is slowed down with currency sinks. So as players have things to use their currency on, that inflation stays under control. And more importantly, currency sinks are most frequently used to add friction to wealth generation. And so another way of thinking about that, again, is you're paying a higher and higher tax the more profit you make per hour in Path of Exile. And people don't really care about that. What they care about is their profit per hour. And this is what keeps Path of Exile feeling fair, fun, and gives a lot of people the ability to progress their character and build a lot of strength. So if you've enjoyed this video, please stay tuned for part 2, where I'll specifically talk about how we can take these lessons from Path of Exile and apply them to the US economy to make things feel a lot better. Thanks again. Subscribe for more content, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.